Okay, we have a lot of people that can't be here today for a variety of reasons, so class seems sparse. I'm kind of expecting that. I do have exams to give back that are graded without the points added up, but we're going to do that at the end so that people who are joining on Teams don't have to wait around for us to restart Teams later. So we're going to have lecture stuff first. Then I will stop Teams and stop recording, and we'll go over exams at the end. Those of you here in person, you should have an index card at your seat that's either green or blue. That's if you have a question that you want to write down and turn in at the end of class. That's what those are for. You can also just raise your hand and ask any question that you feel like during this whole unit. If you don't use your index card, just leave it there. If you do have a question that you want to turn in, if you would leave those on that one chair that's over there by itself at the back of the room. That'll be the spot to leave question cards. And during this unit, whatever people ask by raising their hand or by turning in a question card, I'll go ahead and talk about that, and then it ends up later on the test in some way. So some of what the topics are that I talk about in this section, I'll base it on what the questions are. So I wish I could do all of my classes always that way, but this section people tend to have more questions or comments about it. So we're going to get started, and this particular slide set that we're on that says reproduction and contraception, we're going to be using this for 3 or 4 lecture days. So it's got a lot of pictures in it, and it's a big slide set. It's going to be for multiple lecture days. And today, the goal is to get through the first 14 or something like that. And it's going to be a lot of the same pictures that you labeled in lab yesterday. But what I'm doing in here is talking about, okay, this is the structure. This is what it's for. So it's kind of the anatomy we looked at in lab. Where is it and what's it called? And in here, we're going to talk about the function. So as we get going, what is the point of your reproductive system? To reproduce. That's what the point of the reproductive system is to reproduce. And there are kind of some different requirements, let's say, for female reproductive system, what jobs it has to do versus the male reproductive system. So I'm starting some board notes here. What are the essential functions of female reproductive system and essential functions of male? And for both sexes, the very most important part of the reproductive system is to produce gametes. That goes for both sexes. If all you can do is just make the gametes, you are pretty far along these days to being able to reproduce and to have a child because of all the different technologies that we have. As long as you can make gametes. So what's the female gamete? Eggs. And what are the male gametes? Sperm. And I want you to put a note about the gametes that they are haploid. They're haploid, and they are going to have one copy of each gene. Later on in this unit, we come to kind of a genetics set of materials, and we'll talk more about genes and genetics there. But the most important function of both reproductive systems, female and male, is to make gametes, eggs and sperm, and the gametes need to be haploid. That's the foundational part of reproductive system. For male reproductive system, really all the other stuff it has to do is to support delivery of the gametes to the female reproductive system. So in the male, the testis is making the sperm, and that's the most important thing. Everything else is just to deliver gametes to the female reproductive system. Female reproductive system does not need to deliver gametes, it needs to accept gametes, I guess. I'm going to put that in parentheses. It needs to be set up to accept male gametes. And then what's the other huge part of female reproductive system that it needs to do? Support what? Supporting is yeah. Supporting what?
Like the sperm cell, right?
Supporting the sperm.
Like the sperm has to attach to the uterine wall, right?
Yeah. So initially supporting sperm, and then what about the next long time after that? What? Development of what? The baby. So, or the embryo, the fetus, eventually the baby. So, female reproductive system, most of the structure of it is set up to support the development of the offspring. So, support embryonic fetal development. Or to support a pregnancy, essentially. With modern technology, we cannot quite mimic pregnancy support totally out of the body at this time. We'll get back to that later, but female reproductive system, make eggs, accept male gametes, support fetal development. So female reproductive systems have more jobs that need to be done, particularly. So we're going to start with this picture, and this is one that you labeled yesterday. What I'm going to be doing for these lectures is pointing at part of the picture and then writing on the board a description of that thing and what it does. So if you're watching this video later, or if you're watching on Teams, you'll want to check for the board notes later, or get those from me later. But you can also write along with me as I am saying the words, writing what they're doing. So which part on here in female reproductive system is making gametes? It's the ovaries. And yesterday we learned where ovaries are, but I didn't mention what they did. But this is one ovary and this is one ovary. And the role of the ovaries is to produce eggs in female. And most women would have 2 ovaries, one on each side. So I'm actually not going to write that down. You can write it down. Ovaries are producing the gametes. So maybe I'll just put that in a different color on these notes. So in females, it's the ovaries that are producing eggs as the gametes. And then the second important structure on here are these tubes that are going near to the ovaries and also connecting with uterus here. And these tubes can be called fallopian, that would have a capital F on it, fallopian tubes or uterine tubes. And the purpose of the fallopian tubes is twofold. Firstly, they are going to allow eggs to travel toward uterus. So once eggs are released during ovulation, which we'll talk about in a minute, these fallopian tubes are going to encourage the egg, it's one per month, to start moving down toward the uterus. They are not one-way tubes though. So eggs will be moving this way, and at the same time, it's possible for sperm to move up through the tubes and go and meet the egg. So we want to add that on as well. The second function of fallopian tubes is also to have sperm travel through those tubes to meet the egg. That's going to become important during Friday's material. So you can think of fallopian tubes as kind of like a hallway or a subway tunnel where eggs and sperm could meet.
How do they move? Is it through pressure?
I'll get to that in a minute about how they move, because there's a better picture that shows how they move. But I like that question. The other important things on here that I want you to note are these white structures. So there's one here, here, and these are not on your lab guide for you to learn as named structures, but these white things and this white tissues are ligaments and connective tissue. And what these really are doing are just kind of somewhat keeping the ovaries and the uterus and the fallopian tubes from just kind of drifting around in the pelvic cavity. So you've got ligaments, if you're female, ligaments and connective tissues that are anchoring reproductive structures basically to the front wall of the pelvis here. And we'll see some more examples of that in one of the next pictures. So those ligaments are anchoring somewhat these structures in place. Before we leave this, make a note that this uterus is basically in its smallest possible form. So this would be considered a small uterus and could be empty, so to speak, in a not pregnant person. But for women who have not been pregnant, this is about the size of the uterus compared to the rest of the pelvic cavity. And it can get massively bigger during pregnancy. Okay, so our next picture is one that you did not have during lab, and all of this together, this structure is the ovary. So everything in gray is ovary, and everything in pink right here would be the end of the fallopian tube or the uterine tube. So that's the first label to put on here. Gray is ovary, pink is fallopian tube. And yesterday, I think you all did look at this under the microscope. And someone said it looks kind of like pimples of different sizes. So I'm going to erase this board. I need to take a picture of it. Because there's a lot of important things happening in this ovary and some important facts to know about egg production. Let me get the picture here. And then talk about egg production. There we go. So the first fact that I want you to write down about ovaries is this. Undeveloped or immature eggs, or we could also call eggs oocytes, or you might hear some people say oocyte. Oocytes, that's another word for eggs. These mean the same thing. Those are present in the ovaries from birth. So, as soon as a female infant is born, she already has all the eggs in her ovaries that she's going to have in her entire life. And that number is around 250,000 total. And they would kind of be split between both ovaries. But when, before the age of puberty, all of the eggs in the ovaries are very tiny and they're kind of underdeveloped. And they would be kind of about this size. And the ovary is basically packed full of those. And these would be examples of the immature oocytes. And each oocyte or egg are going to be found in these structures called follicles. The follicles are kind of a globe of cells that surround each egg and they support its development. So the pink, see these pink structures here, those are called follicles. So imagine tiny infant girl, 200,000 immature eggs in the tiny follicles. And then at puberty, when you have certain hormones start to be produced in young girls going through puberty, hormones will promote further development and growth and maturation not off of the eggs and the follicles. So the ovary that you were looking at yesterday, I feel like that was from a cat or something, or maybe a hamster, some kind of mammal. And you noticed in that there were all these different circles of different sizes. When you see the circles that are bigger in size, those are developing follicles that are under the influence of hormones, and they are helping the eggs inside them mature and become ready to get fertilized. So when you look at a whole entire ovary of a mammal that's past puberty, it still has a lot of what we call primary follicles. These would be primary follicles. But then there will be some bigger, more obvious follicles that are further along in their development, and the eggs that they have are closer to being ready, so to speak, ready to be fertilized. So these structures here would be secondary follicles. And after puberty, each month, one mature egg will leave the ovary during what we call ovulation. And we've got a picture coming up next of ovulation. So it's supposed to be one per month. I think since you have two ovaries, it generally alternates sides. Like one egg comes out of the left 1 month and one from the right the next month, but not 100% that way. It's usually one per side every month. And then once that egg leaves, the follicle that is left behind, that the egg just came out of, that becomes a structure called corpus luteum. Corpus luteum. And on the picture up there, the corpus luteum is this structure. So there's the egg, it just released during ovulation, and the follicle wall gets left behind, and it turns into this thing called corpus luteum. Corpus means body, and luteum means yellow. And they literally look yellow. The corpus luteum is then, at that point, going to produce hormones for a little while afterward. And those hormones are important for pregnancy and menstruation, and we'll talk about those later. So in one ovary, around 125,000 primary follicles with immature eggs. After puberty, some of those eggs will start developing more and forming these bigger follicles. And then in one ovary, about every other month, one of the eggs will be released under the influence of female hormones, and it will go outside the ovary, and that's what we call ovulation. How's that seem so far? Raise your hand if you knew any of this before. I'm just curious. Good. That like gets better over the years. I didn't know any of this before like I got pregnant and started reading up on things. Good. Okay. So ovulation is the bursting out of the egg, and I really love this picture. One of my favorite. Great. Okay. Okay, so the white thing that looks kind of shiny and fresh, that's the egg or the oocyte, and it's mature now. And this structure over here on the right that's pink, that's the ovary. And during ovulation, the egg is going to kind of just burst out of the ovary, and it's kind of traumatic to the ovary wall. And some women can actually feel this happen. Once they know what it feels like. So if you've ever had like a weird one-time sharp pain low down on one side, it might be what's called ovulation pain. Some women don't feel it. Some women feel it every time, and it's a little bit of a trauma when it comes out of the ovary. And then on this side, on the left in the red, this is the beginning of the fallopian tube. And there's this gap. There's this watery space in between those. So I want to go back and show this. Okay, this picture, here's the ovary, here's the end of the fallopian tube, and it looks like they're touching. But there's actually kind of usually some space in between it. And if we go back and look here, we can see the space. So there is this void or this weird watery no man's land, haha, literally, in between the ovary and the start of the fallopian tube. And the fallopian tube is having to get the egg to go into it. And the way it does this is cool. So we're going to look at that next.
And the egg like completely miss.
Yeah, they can. There have been some bizarre cases where women have had a blocked fallopian tube on one side, or like their fallopian tube and their ovary on one side was not working. No, wait, the ovary on one side was not working, but the tube was open. And the ovary on the other side was working, but the tube was blocked. And like by a 1,000,000,000 to 1 event, the egg went to the other side. That's kind of almost act of God level miracle. But they can rarely drift around and make it to the other side. But that is not the usual. It's usually going to be the egg on one side is going to go into that fallopian tube because it's so much closer.
Do you know why the body is like that?
Double-sided like that?
Yeah, like why is there a gap? It doesn't sound like smart.
Oh, why is there a gap? I do not know that. Professor Rudd might know that because he knows a lot more about body plan development and stuff. But if I remember, I'll ask him.
Yeah.
I do not know. That's not how I would design it. If we're gonna come up with a plan. This seems too treacherous and risky. But it works well generally. So here's ovary, there's the egg. It's in the watery space right now, and here's the fallopian tube. And the way that the egg gets into the fallopian tube is through fluid currents. There we go. It's through fluid currents. So this is a picture of what the inside of the fallopian tube looks like. So draw an arrow from here to here and say that's the inside of the fallopian tube. And the fallopian tubes have cilia. So our fallopian tubes or uterine tubes are lined with ciliated cells that flap or sweep fluids inward. So these little cell extensions act like cilia inside the fallopian tubes, and they flap in a direction that sucks liquid in. So it's like the slightest fluid current that is moving this way. So you could draw some arrow going up in this way that represents that's the movement of fluid. And when the egg bursts out, hopefully the ovary is pretty close to the fallopian tube, and the egg will kind of get sucked in through that current and find its way through the fallopian tube. Different women are going to have different distances between these. Not hugely different, but you know, if your ovary is kind of pointing down here and your fallopian tube is up here, that's going to make it slightly harder for that person to get pregnant because the egg has to go further. It might be more likely to get lost, but they're supposed to be pretty close together. So the egg will start moving this direction, coming toward the uterus. I'm going to take a picture, and then there's some other structures on this picture that we will need to learn more about. Yeah. So the egg is out. The egg is in the fallopian tube or the uterine tube now, and it's moving toward the uterus. And the whole reason that the egg exists and is moving toward the uterus is just on the chance that there might be sperm around at that time, at that month, and it might get fertilized. And if it did get fertilized, so that's a big if, and we'll talk about what has to happen for that tomorrow. If the egg is fertilized, it should implant, which is basically like stick onto the wall and burrow in, which sounds weird. It should implant or burrow into the uterine lining. So the lining of the uterus. And so here's uterus. And this layer of it is muscle. Right here. So where you see this kind of red layer that looks like muscle, draw a line from that out to this space and label that as myo for the muscle, myometrium. That's the muscle layer. Somebody asked yesterday about cramps. If you have cramps of your uterus, you're a female. But when you feel a cramp, what it is contraction of the uterus muscle to an extent that it causes pain. That's what a cramp is. What is the real purpose of having muscle in the uterus? Why do you need that?
Push your baby out.
To help push a baby out. And like you hardly ever need that. At least in modern society, we don't have children every year. But that's what the muscle is for, to help when it's time for birth to push the baby out. And that's what we call contractions. Cramps are contractions for no reason. That's what they are. And then the second structure that we need to know on here is this particular lining here that's in the light pink. So it would be this layer and kind of this layer right here in the light pink. And that's called endometrium. Endometrium is the lining of the uterus. And endometrium, the real function of it, what it's for, is to, let's say, nourish and support early development of an embryo. So if the egg is fertilized, it is supposed to go to the uterine lining and kind of burrow in there. And that uterine lining will start feeding, nourishing, supporting the very earliest development until there's a placenta. That's what endometrium is for. A new lining is grown every month. Well, is grown and then shed every month in case. Every month. You grow a new lining in case there's a fertilized egg that needs it. And if there is not a fertilized egg that needs it, the lining is gotten rid of by the process of menstruation, which is having the monthly period for women. This, I also would not design it this way if it was up to me, because you build it, you shed it, you build it, you shed it. Just goes on and on for years, just in case. But that's the system. Different animals, other mammals do not do this every month. That'd be great. I don't know the details of the different mammals. That's a Rudd thing that's his training. But that's what menstruation is for. So, oh, no embryo this month? Get rid of it. Build it over. That's what endometrium is for. So endometrium is going to extend all the way from here, so the end of the uterus where the cervix is. It goes from here all the way through the lining of the whole uterus, and it also kind of goes up through here as well. So kind of all of that pink layer. The other things I want to point out on this is you can kind of see now some of the ligaments a little bit better in the sheet-like connective tissue that's holding this in place. And that's kind of going to be holding fallopian tubes and ovaries close together so that they don't drift too far apart from each other. So all of this stuff, that's a ligament, that's a ligament, ligament, sheet ligament, ligament here. During pregnancy, as the uterus grows, it stretches on the ligaments, and that can hurt too, because they have to kind of flex with the growth of the uterus.
What if you tear those ligaments?
If you tear them, it's not common to tear them. Do you know that somebody that happened to? The reason it's not common to tear them is because of where they are. So these are in the pelvis. And generally, the only way that you're going to tear those is if you break your pelvis dramatically. And pelvis is one of the stronger set of bones in the female body. So those ligaments don't often get torn. They can get stretched painfully during pregnancy, but tearing them is uncommon. I'm sure it's happened to people, but it's not near as common as like your ACL or your shoulder ligaments or any. These are some of the most protected place in the body, and they don't tear very often. I like that question.
When women have endometriosis, does that have to do with endometriosis?
Yes, I'm so glad you asked that, because this is the perfect place to talk about that. So what the question is when women have endometriosis. Perfect place to ask this. Okay, so the condition called endometriosis, probably at least one person in here has it. It's really common in women. And what that is when you have the endometrium grows and sheds. I'm going to be inelegant about this, but it grows and sheds in a place where it's not supposed to, in the wrong place. It's normal and healthy for endometrium to grow and shed inside the uterus. For some reason, there are several women that have endometrium on the outside of the uterus, sometimes on the surface of the ovary, sometimes on part of their abdominal wall, which is weird, but wherever it is, it acts like endometrium and it grows every month under the influence of hormones, and it sheds every month. If that's happening inside the uterus, that tissue has a way to get out of the body. It's going to be shed into the uterus, and then it will come through the cervix, go through the vagina, and act like a period should act, I guess you could say. But if you've got endometrium over here and it grows and sheds, where's it going to go? Like, it's in the void. And then you've got this basically, I don't know what else to call it. There is a name for this. I'm going to call it the void. I mean, it's the liquid in amongst your abdominal organs, but I'm going to call it the void.
Would that be like the serous fluid then?
Serous fluid would be mixed in with it. Yeah. It would be mostly serous fluid. But if you've got basically endometrial dead tissue building up in your abdomen, that's really harmful, and it can be painful. And a lot of women will have a lot of, pain and abdominal problems and not know what is wrong. And a lot of times it's endometriosis. The other thing that can happen with endometriosis is if you're having too much lining here, it can scar your fallopian tubes, and it can cause infertility in a lot of women.
Is there any way to fix it with like hormone therapy or something?
Hormones, like you can take hormones to basically stop your period.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it would take to stop endometriosis problems. You can also have what's called ablation, where if it's a surgery, if the surgeon can find all the places where the tissue is, they can go in and like burn it off with a laser or something like that. But it can be hard to get all of it. And a lot of women that have endometriosis will end up having an early hysterectomy, or it's really a problem. And a lot of women have it and they don't know that they have it because people don't talk about it enough. So I'm really glad that you asked that question. It can cause a lot of problems, and it's way too common to have endometriosis.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of women after they give birth, they like cut the fallopian tube. Do they cut the fallopian tube? Or is it-
Yeah. And I'll talk more about that on contraception day, but an excellent way to not get pregnant is to seal up the tubes or cut them or do something to block the egg from ever coming down here. So that's what a tubal ligation or tubes tied, that's what that is. And we'll see some different pictures, well, not real pictures, but like cartoon pictures of that next week. That's what it is, yeah. Yeah, excellent questions. Last thing, ooh, slowing down. Last thing on this picture that I want you to circle is this area here, which is cervix. So one circle around the cervix, and make a note there that the cervix, I'm going to write this up here where you all can see it. The cervix is either the exit to the uterus if you're endometrium or an egg that didn't get fertilized, you're coming out. If you're sperm, it's the entrance. So it's kind of a gateway, the cervix. And the cervix produces mucus, which can change, we'll just say for now, it changes under the influence of hormones. So your cervix is always supposed to be making some kind of mucus, and it's called cervical mucus. Different times a month, it has a different chemical makeup. Certain times of month, it's like in a state that's helpful to sperm, and other times of month, it is in a state that is not helpful to sperm. So that's an important fact to know. And then we get to vagina here, which is either the entrance for sperm or the exit for cervical mucus and unfertilized eggs and endometrium. Healthy vaginas, write this here. Healthy vaginas have microbes that live there, that are supposed to live there. It's part of your normal microbial flora. And those microbes, if they are healthy and doing well, they're going to produce acidity. Healthy vaginas are acidic. There's your weird fact of the day. It's supposed to be that way. So certain bacteria are supposed to be growing there and living there and producing acid, and that's part of a healthy environment for vaginas. This picture, I do not have anything particular to say about it that's new. But it's in here if you want to use it to practice anatomy labeling. I think I'm going to not try to start on male anatomy today, but have time to go over the exam. But I do want to tell you in this section how I tend to ask you things on the test. So on exam 5, what I tend to do for the anatomy section is there will be different diagrams shown. So it could be this one, it's not this, or this one. And what I do is I make a list of functions or facts. So like one of the functions might be this structure supports development of the early embryo. And that might be letter C. And what you would do with that is you look on the diagram and you write letter C where the endometrium is. Or if it's something like this structure produces fluid currents that help an oocyte move, what's doing that? What's producing fluid currents on all of this?
The ciliated cells.
The ciliated cells. And so what you need to do is find where that happens and write the letter on the diagram. So I'm not asking what the parts are called for lecture. I'm asking like, where is this thing happening? And then you put the letter on the picture. So that's a big part of the anatomy section on this test coming up. So what I'm going to do now is stop this recording and turn off Teams, and we will go over exams.